Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole. Today is a special day. Well, I believe every day is a special day. But today's extra special because we have a guest with us who is guaranteed to stir your soul, to, I believe, to uplift each and every one of us based on some really deep thinking about who we are, how we live, and how we engage our faith. And I say that because she is a minister, she is an author. Let me tell you who our guest is. She is Reverend Jen Bailey, and she's got quite an impressive resume. She's an ordained minister, public theologian, national leader in the multi faith movement for justice. She is the founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, which is a womanist led organization equipping community organizers, faith leaders, and activists with resources for connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. Also, she's an Ashoka Fellow, an Aspen Ideas Scholar, an On Being Fellow, a New Pluralist Field Builder, and a Truman Scholar. I could go on and on, but I actually want us to talk to her. So let me tell you, she's written a book called To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And that's what we're going to talk about. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Jen Bailey.
Thank you so much for
Hi.
having me. Hi.
Oh, I'm so happy. I was remembering that I first saw you on screen at the Code Generate seminar, I guess, day of engagement with encore.org. And I'm a senior fellow there. And I just was so pleased to see you in conversation uh, with the creator of On Being, which is such an incredible platform. And to see a young woman of color holding it down, talking about faith in a way that just makes it real for a lot of people. Because, Dr. Jen, I want to say that for many people who are of faith and who are young, they often feel like talking about God and talking about church is very old school and not for them.
Mm,
So I'm curious about your relationship to faith and communicating, especially with young people, so that they would be interested.
right. Thank you so much for that question. And I would say that as a 34-year-old millennial, I kind of inhabit that in between space between a generation of my peers and colleagues who left the institutional church in part because they saw it and is not wrong, right? as either too conservative, not responding to the needs of communities, not speaking forth their values around justice and equity from the pulpits. And at my very core, I'm still a church girl. And so I see my vocational life as having one foot within the institutional church. I'm ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest historically Black denomination in the US. And the primary side of my ministry is actually not within the four walls of the church, but is through my work at Faith Matters Network. And so it's so interesting because one of the letters that I write in my book is to Generation Z, because now I'm at that like in between phase in my life where I lovingly call myself an auntie in training. And
I love
part
that.
of that, right? Part of that is about no longer being the fresh young thing. Although in the life of the church, I'm young until I'm 45, right? That's where we are institutionally in the church. And part of that letter was really spurred by the desire to speak to young folks who are asking really big questions about their life and vocation, many of whom may not find themselves feeling comfortable in a typical Christian context in the church, but for whom spirit and God and a sense of higher purpose and community are at the core of how they understand themselves in the world. And so I would say to the young person who is maybe estranged from that Sunday morning experience that they might have grown up with for a number of different reasons because of hurt that they might be nursing in that space, that just because you may not be showing up in the pews every Sunday doesn't mean that you've left your faith behind. And actually, there are so many ways that you can and often do express the core values and tenets that you've been taught out there in the world. And so just know you're not alone. It could be hard because, some folks be judgmental in the church. They don't want to talk about real stuff. And
Well,
so,
and you write about that in your book. You talk about the female elders in the church whom you revere and yet point out their imperfections, which I actually think is really important about those leaders in the church and also those at the top. I remember when I was growing up in Baltimore in the United Methodist Church, uh, wonderful community of people, but I watched a number of different ministers say one thing and do another. And it
Mm.
became very difficult for me to trust them because, well, they're saying what we should be doing, but then if they're not doing it, then, as a child, I thought, oh my God, I can't believe anything. And you
Mm.
write about this a bit in your book to say, look, we're flawed. We are imperfect. That doesn't mean like you have to throw away the baby with the bathwater in a sense. Uh, how did you come to an understanding that being flawed is okay? It doesn't mean that you're no longer a person of faith.
Yeah, I think that it was both in the model. I talk in the book about the church mothers. So these elders in the church who really helped broaden my imagination about who God was and who were the true leaders of the church. So any Sunday morning, you will go to a church, and I guarantee you, most of the folks who are in the pews are probably Black women in my context, even if that's not who's preaching from the pulpit. And so
That's right.
there is this really powerful way in which I saw these women who were of a generation coming out of Jim and Jane Crow, who knew what it meant to make a way out of no way, as we say in the church. And that phrase, make a way out of no way, to me evokes magic and conjure. And not in that sort of hashtag Black girl magicness, but out of a real lived experience of thinking about how one ought survive and has to survive and thrive in the midst of a system that is structured to your detriment and not for your flourishing. And they were imperfect, right? Like in all of their beauty, and I mean beauty, like the big church hats and the outfits to the T. The
Sunday best.
Sunday best at all times, right? And encouraged us to wear our Sunday best. And like sometimes they had some backwards thoughts about gender, right? And sometimes they were always the most encouraging of a particular type of rebellion or question asking. And that doesn't mean that you throw them away, right? In my experience was that it helped to know that I could be flawed and seeing their flaws. But also, it helped to go back to the Gospels and see some incidences of Jesus not showing up at his full best, right? So often we tell the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman who comes begging for help and who Jesus says, go eat with the dogs, right? Like Jesus's own biases are showing up even there. I mean, in the holy space, we'd be like, well, Jesus was just trying to teach her a lesson about resilience. I'm like, nah, Jesus had some like real, live, deep, right, prejudices given the social context that he came up in. And so, I mean, it may sound.
Wait,
Yeah.
I just have to say, there are folks who are probably listening going, what? What did she say?
I was about to say, oh, I'm about to get in trouble, right?
No, actually, WBAI is very progressive, pretty liberal, but I'm amplifying that point because that is a radical thought. I mean, many people in the church say do not ever, under any circumstances, question anything about Jesus, right? But actually, your approach, I think, is a fresh approach and one for sure that young people are having because people want to know what's real and what's not real. And this text that is so old, but that was written by other people, not by Jesus. Folks want to understand it. So for you, again, as an ordained minister, as a young woman and you were taught not, I mean, you're in the Black church now, you weren't educated in the seminary of Blackness. So talk about your training and coming to an understanding because you were trained in prestigious but white institutions, and now you are preaching and writing about something that could be considered radical in terms of uh, Black thought around the church.
Yeah, It's so interesting. So I went to seminary at 24, went to Vanderbilt University Seminary in Nashville, Tennessee. And it was the first time in my life, having come up in the church and saw the church as my primary space of education, Christian education, that I was for the first time academically studying religion. And the thing that I found in seminary that I wish I would have found at 14, 15, 16, as I was asking these big questions about who God was in my life, was womanism, and in particular, womanist theology. So, for folks who don't know, womanist theology emerged in the 1980s and 90s out of the perspective and experience of Black women, and in particular, Black women in the church who were asking questions about their intersectional identities, their experience of oppression, and in the context of all of that, who is God for me now? And I had the good fortune of being taught by Black women, scholars and theologians and ethicists who saw themselves as part of a continuation of a lineage of Black women who were like questioning for a long time the very fabric of the church. And so, for me, I see.
Excuse me, Dr. Jen, you were taught by these Black women scholars at Vanderbilt?
At Vanderbilt.
So kudos to Vanderbilt for having those women there. Seriously, I think that's important for people to know.
Yeah. So let me call some of their names because it's important for me always to recognize the people who've helped form me. So call the names of Dr. Stacey Floyd Thomas and Dr. Emily Towns and Dr. Phyllis Shepherd and so many others who have been instrumental in forming some of my core ideologies and theologies and how I understand the text as read through the perspective of Black women. And what is interesting to me is that while it may seem radical in this moment, I'm actually part of a long lineage of women of faith who question the system, right? Whether that be the system of the church or the system politically. So I see myself as part of a lineage that includes people like Fannie Lou Hamer, includes people like Ida B. Wells, includes people like Jarena Lee, who was the first woman licensed to preach in the AME church way back at the turn of the 19th century, right? So these rabble-rousing women who were shaking the very foundations, both about how we think about hierarchy in the church, but also who God is. Because if God is not made in Genesis 1 talks about us being made in the image of God, right? So for me, that means that God also has to be a Black woman, right? That God also has to look like my grandmama in them, right? Those church women who were toiling in the kitchen and asking big questions about how their God was speaking to their material conditions. And so I guess that's radical, but I also see myself as part of a radical tradition that reaches back.
That's why I wanted you to be able to speak to it, because I do think that there are people who will look at you and go, ooh, who is she? People also who don't know. You mentioned names of people who many of us know, like Ida B. Wells and Fannie Lou Hamer, but I want to say there are plenty who don't know who they are, and certainly who don't know who those professors are. So the fact that you call out names, and throughout your book also you call out names, so that you humanize the stories that you're sharing in your book, which I think is so important. Hopefully some people will look up some of those names so that they can educate themselves further. So your book is called To My Beloveds: Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. Can you, in your book, you define this, and I'd like for you to define it for us now. What does beloved mean to you?
Yeah, so it helps that one of my favorite texts of all time is Toni Morrison's Beloved. So when I think about those people in my life, both those who I've held close, family members, friends, but also elders and ancestors and folks I've never met who have helped shaped my imagination about what is possible, I count them as beloved, as those who I hold dear to me, close to me. And, beloved is a term that actually comes up several times in the context of the Bible. It's used to refer to the community of faith, right? So we have people in the epistles, Pauline epistles addressing that, Paul addressing the congregations throughout the ancient world as beloveds. We also, have Song of Songs where people want to talk about how controversial sex in the Bible is, but Song of Songs, right? Song of Solomon is all about, calling people my beloved. It's a little racy, right? And speaks to this really beautiful way in which to be beloved is to be in many ways embodied, to be embodied and in relationship to and with. And so I hold a lot of those folks in my life as beloved. I hold these sort of ancestors I've never met, but whose stories I carry with me as part of a long lineage of Black women in my life who have helped inform me in this very moment as beloved. Shoot, I even hold like, am I gonna get in trouble? I'm gonna get in trouble for saying, but I hold those moments of like, and I'm a cursing reverend, so forgive me, but like shit talking with my friends is beloved moments, right? Right. That when I'm with my girls who have been my girls since I was 18 and who have grown into womanhood with me, where we're like toasting and drinking wine, because people do drink wine in the Bible too, right? Like those are beloved moments that I cherish because they are sacred. And I think so often when we use the term sacred, we use it to refer to something that is far away or in the context of a confined religious space. But for me, sacredness happens when one or two are gathered, when we can connect on a deep human level, whether that be within of the four walls of the church or in nature, right? That there is something sacred that we can observe in the very gift that is life. And for me, so much of that reverence for life comes out of my proximity to death in my life and walking alongside those who've died.
And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Let folks know you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We have the honor and privilege of talking today to Dr. Jen Bailey and Reverend. Reverend Doctor is what you really are called, right? That's what you
I don't got the one day. I don't have the doctorate yet, but one day you're speaking it prophetically. How about that?
I'm speaking it prophetically. And she has written a book called To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And it really is a beautifully written book, Dr. Jen. I really, as a writer myself, I appreciate beautiful writing. And, what I like about it is you take us right into the heart. And this, for me, this moment in time has been a moment of a lot of loss. People who I love deeply of different ages have passed within the past 7 to 10 days. And so I'm living in that space. And thank you, as I'm reading, I immediately felt the tears coming. And like, okay, how am I going to read this book and get ready for this interview and feel the tears? But honestly, when you just said about your reverence for life being so keenly aligned with loss and death, that is part of life. And as you share stories, I really do feel that there's a heart opening that you create in each of the letters. And I'm curious about your process in writing the letters because you start with talking about your mother who had a 14-year battle with cancer, and you were on the front lines with her. And as you recalled that, it brought me to tears. I wonder, how were you able to write about it and share so deeply and be composed? Or were you? Did you have to be composed? I'm just curious.
So I was not composed. It's so interesting. This book has felt like the culmination of a long time coming. And so the beginnings of that letter specifically, which is about my mom's death, actually was stuff that I wrote while I was sitting with her and she was on hospice at home. So I was sitting next to her bedside as she was slowly declining and needing an outlet to sort of figure out all the complicated feelings I was feeling around her death. I will never forget when she turned to me. We were in the hospital. It was right before she came home on hospice, and she asked me to speak to her as a minister. And I was like, what? No, but I'm your baby. Right? Like,
Right.
And
How
she
old
said,
were you at that point?
I would have been, 27.
That's hard.
And she said, Jennifer, talk to me about forgiveness because there are some people in my life that I need to forgive. And I had a set of assumptions about knowing, because my mom was my best friend, knowing some of her history and knowing the way that she navigated some of the relationships in her life and some people who didn't quite do her right. And so I asked her who she needed to forgive, and she said her mother, which surprised me because my grandmother and my mom were just as close as my mom and I were. And my grandmother actually just passed away a month ago. And so this is my first time telling the story publicly because I was holding it so close, not wanting to share while she was still with us. But she really began to uncover and dig into like family secrets and things that had been complicated. And she felt like she couldn't raise with her own mom about her paternity, like the paternity of her dad, like a lot of, the stuff that the elders don't tell us, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. Like, old folks they have their stories, right? Which is why I revere elders, but I also see them in the fullness of their humanity and as complicated beings, right? So that moment is just one of many that, as I was walking with my mom during those last few months of her life, I moved back home and was one of her primary caretakers, was powerful for me in showing her vulnerability and humanity. Because I think we view our parents sometimes as superheroes. And I think in particular, Black women are asked to be superheroes and carry the weight of their community. And what I've found myself as I was reflecting, both in writing that letter, is just like the deep level of resentment I can feel about that sometimes, right? That as Black women, we're asked to be strong. There's this sort of mythos of the strong Black woman. And my mom's back was certainly strong from carrying her community and her family on it. And I wonder if she had had time to rest, if she had had time to pay attention to what was going on in her body sooner, would she have caught the cancer sooner? If we had a healthcare system that was designed to diagnose and find illness within Black women's bodies, would she have gotten treated better? If we had an economic system that didn't mean that she needed to work as hard as she needed to work, would she have been able to have the space to truly heal? And so it feels complicated, even 5 years after her passing, as I begin to continue to grieve and unpack. It's only been recently that I've been able to really look at her picture and not just remember the end, but remember the totality of the 28 years that I had with her.
Wow. Well, and you were young when she became ill, right? How old were you?
I was 14. I tell this story in the book. I actually found out about her cancer on my 14th birthday, which was just ill timing. She had to go in to get this surgery. And it happened to be the only day they could schedule. It was on my birthday. And so for half of my life, literally, I only knew myself as the daughter of a sick mother, which is an identity that I don't know that I fully had reckoned with until writing this book, or how much of my life was defined by the sort of precarity of my mom's own health and my proximity to both illness and death. And I think that experience over the past year and a half or so is one that I see in the midst of this pandemic, right? That so many people, when we speak about, the over 700,000 people in the US alone who've died of COVID, right? Death has seemed much more proximate. And as a culture in the US that is not well versed on how to deal with death, and let me correct myself, majority culture is not very well versed on how to deal with death, right? I think that there are ways that folks of color and Indigenous folks have retained our ancient ways of knowing and being with ancestors in death that I've had to recover, right? But we have this habit of thinking that we bury somebody and then you're supposed to forget about it. But a funeral moment, a death moment is only the beginning of a process of grief, and grief that shapes our hearts. That loss is something that is a natural part of the life cycle that we tend to shy away from. We tend not to want to stare death in the face. And when you recognize that there is a beginning, there is a middle, and an end to our lives, that's actually kind of freeing to me, right? Because it tells me that my time here is precious. It also tells me that I don't have to accomplish everything, that I am a part of a continued
It
legacy.
can be a relief, right?
Relief, right? Which is countercultural in a society that tells you that you have to grind till the very end. And I think, especially in this moment of collective grief, there is so much in terms of our opportunity to look death in the face and cherish it, to remind ourselves that even after we lose somebody, when we remember them, they come back to life, right? That those processes, if we could just be honest about it, could really open up a lot for us as a country. I think there are a lot of people who are grieving the death not only of people, but of institutions, ways of being in this moment, um, but don't have the resources or tools to tend to those wounds, to tend to their grieving and grief process.
It's interesting you say that because just like 9/11, when all of us who were aware enough, remember where we
Mhm.
were, what we were doing on that day, and kind of what life was like before and now. So now we have almost 2 years of COVID, which is a very elongated stretch, but I think people will ask for the rest of our lives, where were you during that time? What were you
Mhm.
doing during the time of COVID? And I believe, Dr. Jen, that I keep calling you doctor. I think
I'm telling you,
it's
I'm
in my
receiving it
spirit.
prophetically.
It's
You
in my
just
spirit.
let me receive it, as we say in the church.
It's ingrained in me. That's who you are to me right now. That I'm thinking about the loss that perhaps is clearing the way, or
Mm.
can clear the way for what's next. I mean, for many people, whatever their lives were like before, it's just not like that anymore for so many reasons. Loss during COVID is so profound, as you said, 700,000 and counting of deaths, but also deaths of businesses, deaths of educational institutions, of cultural institutions, of many families who weren't able to
Mm.
survive. So many things. And you address COVID head on in one of your essays. What do you think that people should have as a takeaway to look to what's next after this, whenever this period is fully over?
Yeah, so in that letter, I share the story of a close personal friend who lost her mother to COVID during the early days of the pandemic. And one of the things that was really apparent to me in that initial stretch of time was just how few spaces for collective grief and lament that we had. Um, Both because folks were trying to wrap their minds around what was happening, and at the time we didn't have the political leadership that wanted to be transparent and honest about the depth of loss that we were experiencing. And so part of what that letter is about is calling us back to a sense of collective grief and mourning, because we know that when we grieve collectively, we remember that we're not alone. And so it was a colleague of mine at Faith Matters Network, Margaret, who reminded me of this story. I believe it's in the book of Jeremiah, of these women, these keeners, these women whose job it was in community was to grieve, right? To
Right.
publicly lead the community in their acts of collective grief and mourning and lament. And one of the things that I know to be true is that in my experiences and taste of those moments of collective grief and lament, I'm reminded of that psalm that talks about our mourning becoming dancing. Part of what happens when we begin to do the work of honoring, acknowledging, and seeing the depth of the loss, the depth of the sorrow in community, is that we recognize we're not carrying it alone. And when we know we're not carrying it alone, we recognize that there's a force, there's a community that's not just us that's experiencing it. It begins to make the burden of loss a little bit lighter. And so I can't imagine how we might not be transformed by this moment. Actually, I'm worried about people who aren't being transformed by this moment.
Sure. Sure.
Um, and so to me, it is as much about holding collective grief, but also remembering to tell our children the story of what this is like. I had the experience of giving birth in the middle of COVID last
Yeah.
September. And so, with my first baby, Max. And so, as I think about the story I want to tell him 5, 10, 20 years down the line, that I will continue to tell him the story of this moment, because I do think there's a sense right now, and one of the losses I'm experiencing, I think so many are experiencing, is the lack of intergenerational transfer and storytelling,
Yes.
because we've lost
Yes.
so many elders over the past almost 2 years, is that I want to continue to tell Max this story of this moment. And I'm sure that that story will be transformed as he hears it, as I hear it, as I experience and relive what the lessons are. And so I hope, my hope is that, my radical hope perhaps, is that I hope that we can be able to tell the story of what happened now, not in like some glossy way, right? But that we continue to tell the story and it continues to inform how we think about things like care and mutual aid and what it means to rely on one another coming out of this pandemic.
Excellent. Hey guys, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We are now talking to Jennifer Bailey, who is a reverend, but I'm calling her Doctor too. She's written a wonderful book of letters called To My Beloved, My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. It's a book of beautifully crafted letters that really take you into many heartfelt experiences with a lot of historical context. So they're educational as well as informational and heart moving. Uh, Reverend, see, you're just Dr. Jen to me, so that's it. Dr. Jen is a minister in the AME faith, but she also has the Faith Matters Network, which she's going to tell us about in a moment, so we understand her work from that perspective. But she has very generously offered copies of her book to the Dreamleapers WBAI family. And if you would like to have a copy of her book, please do make a donation to our beloved radio station, which exists, 61 years, even through COVID, we have survived, which counts for a lot. We tell the truth 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. You know that not all media does that. So this is a very precious place as well. And we need your support. And sometimes we have wonderful gifts for you when you make a contribution. Dr. Jen's book, To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope, which she's going to tell us what that means, can be your gift by making a contribution of $30 to WBAI. That is a modest contribution for an incredible book. And I know that this is something that you can read and share with your family. There are discussion points that you can have in unpacking each of the letters, which are really beautiful essays with so much information packed in a really eloquent way. In addition to being a minister, maybe, I guess when I think about it, a lot of ministers are good writers. They're good orators anyway. Here's what I know: you are a good writer, sister. This book is
Thank you.
beautifully written, and WBAI family, for a donation of $30, you may have a copy. To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. You can call us at 212-209-2950. I'll repeat, 212-209-2950. Or you can go online and give to the numeral 2, WBAI.org. There, each letter takes you, kind of transports you to another place of your heart, which, I talk about the heart all the time, but Dr. Jen, you really do. You take us in, and after we're in, and I'm telling you, the tears were falling, but I thought they were tears of release, which was really good. And then there's this whole history lesson that kind of buoys you up, like you said, of not feeling alone. The letters give the sense of community that helps you to not feel alone. So even though the promise, I'm going to tell you from a reader, you will go on an emotional journey with these letters, but you will not feel alone. So
Mm.
call us 212-209-2950, or go to give to WBAI.org, pledge $30, and you will receive a copy of To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. So what is radical hope? That's
Yes.
a concept that you write about in the book. What does that mean?
So often when we talk about the concept of hope, we think about this sort of light, fluffy aspiration. But what the Black women in my life taught me is that hope is not an aspiration, right? Hope is the choice to live and be transformed each and every day and see yourself as an agent of change in your community. And so I particularly use the term radical, not to be evocative necessarily, but because I went back to my nerdiness. I'm like, I'm going to go to the thesaurus and think about what radical really means. And what the root of the word radical is actually rooted, right? So a hope that is rooted. And for me, my hope, my radical hope, is rooted in the reality and the lived experiences of the women who came before me, of the women in my life, both the church women and the women in my family, who not just survived, but thrived. And so it's a hope that's not light and fluffy, but is grounded, that has itself, sees itself as part of a bigger context and picture and story and experience of imagination, of creativity, and is really grounded in the everydayness that can happen and the miracles that can happen in the everydayness.
I also like to go to the dictionary. So when you talk about this in your book about taking us to the dictionary, and one of those trips to the dictionary for you was looking at the word apocalypse, and that we can say we're still in the midst of an apocalypse with this COVID-19, with racial reckoning, and over the generations. I mean, there've been so many experiences that we could call apocalyptic. You studied Greek. Is that what to get to an understanding of the Bible from that perspective? Can you talk about what apocalypse actually means and how you apply it in your book?
Right. So often when we think about the term apocalypse, we have this cinematic imagination about the end of days. And my husband went to film school, so I watch a lot of those type of movies. But really, if you go back to the Greek root of the word apocalypse, it means to uncover. And so when we talk about apocalyptic moments, what we're actually talking about are moments of great uncovering. And what we know is that once we see something, for those of us who are visually impaired, right, we can't unsee it, to use that metaphor. Or once we hear something, or once something has been revealed and is out in the open, it becomes much harder to put back in a box, right? And so I feel like we are finding ourselves in a moment of several apocalypses that are happening at the same time, whether that be an apocalypse around an uncovering moment around racial justice, which in the course of my 34 years, I think George Floyd is one example of that, but I can go back to, and so many, when I think about how I was politicized post Trayvon Martin or the Gina 6, or as I talk about in the book, when I was in kindergarten, Rodney King was happening, right? So that there's actually sort of an arc and a continuation of a story of apocalyptic reckonings around our country's inability to tend to one of its original wounds, which is the exploitation of Black and Indigenous bodies for the sake of the building of this republic. And so there's an apocalypse around race happening in this moment. I think there's an apocalypse around issues of climate change, right? Which is when I talk to my little cousins in Gen Z and the things that they are most stressed out about, or the sort of big challenges that they find themselves facing and staring down, one of the first things they often talk to me about is climate change, right? And then we have this sort of apocalypse happening around COVID-19 and what it is uncovering about both our ability and inability to care for one another. What happens when, in our context in the US, we center and revere individualism and individual freedoms over the well-being of the collective, right? So all of those moments seem to be coalescing in this time into a series of apocalypses. And so the question for me remains, once things have been uncovered, now that we have out in the open things that had previously either been hidden or not spoken about, what are we going to do about it, right?
Exactly.
Because actually inaction is an option, and we see that happening all around us. And I just can't imagine especially now as I'm stepping into my emerging identity as mother, not doing something about this because I want the world that I am leaving behind for Max, my son, to be changed. And I have a great deal of radical hope that this moment can actually break down some of those systems so that we aren't so um, obsessed with, I think is the word I want to use, with power, with holding on to the way things were. Because when we allow things to die a natural death in some cases, there's an opportunity, and we talk about this in the book, to compost, right? To take that which was most nourishing from the systems and institutions that have served us previously, to let some things die, because some things, and quite frankly, some people need to die for us really to see the transformation that we want to see. And I'm not willing to throw away everything, right? And discard the lessons of the past or of those institutions, but rather, in the field of agriculture, I come from a line of women who knew how to make magic out of the soil. I am not a grower. I'm not a gardener, but my mama and my grandmothers were. And they were the first composters I knew. So they would take leftover food and use it to fertilize. And so in the same way as we think about this moment in composting institutions so that it might fertilize what wants to emerge in this moment, which will necessarily be different because we have a different context and world that we're operating in.
I love that concept of composting these things rather than trying to eradicate them, because what would eradication look like anyway? That's unclear. But also, and perhaps you can take this back to the Bible to examine, but we are living in times where a lot of truths are rising to the surface, with George Floyd being the tipping point. As you said, I mean, I can go back to Amadou Diallo and others who were before you were even born, I think. Um, and we have the insurrection on January 6th. So we have these opposites that are occurring, people who are unwilling to see the truth for what it is, people who are espousing from the highest levels of leadership things that are untrue. Just what happened with Facebook, what is true, what is not true, what is honorable, what is not honorable. I mean, these are the wars of the world that have gone on forever, in cloaked differently right now. Um, and you even write about this, that it can be hard to have radical hope when you see so much despair and so much dishonesty. As a reverend, how do you give people hope? How do you remind people, infuse them with hope when it can sometimes feel like it doesn't matter what difference I make? Another young black man is going to be murdered. Another white supremacist is going to tell a lie and get to the top. Another capitalist who only cares about putting money in his or her pocket is going to make money while we can't buy food. What? Where is hope in that?
So in those moments, I encourage people to do two things. One is to have a long view of time is sometimes helpful. And that's why I always love to sit at the feet of senior saints and playground prophets, so like babies, right? To help me contextualize like this moment that we find ourselves in, certainly may be filled with despair, but in the witness of my grandmothers and my aunties and great aunts and others is a real seismic shift from when, my grandmother was born in 1932 and her experience growing up was radically different than the one that I had. And sometimes that's not satisfying, right? To have a long view of time. And so,
however, even that, like if you talk to people from other countries and European countries, and they're like, this is a blink in time, just how long America's even been alive. Exactly. Have some patience. So it's a good point, the long view.
Yeah. So there's both the desire for a long view that I would tell folks. And I think there is something about the celebration and the insistence on celebrating the small wins and joys along the way. That however, one might conceive of that. I also always point back to there's a scripture that talks about Now unto us him who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that we can hope for and ask, right? Him or her being God, right? That there is this real sense that I find in the scriptures that the spirit of the divine is within each of us, not just in some sort of cosmic way, but that we are empowered through that spirit to act. And so when we think about the material conditions before us, it's not that we are called to be passive and just wait for the heavens to open and something to descend, but actually that my God has given me a portion of God's blessings, a portion of God's power to actually move towards change in the here and now. And so that makes me feel bold. Like, you telling me I got the same spirit Jesus had in him to act and transform and uproot systems? Then yes, I'm going to lean into that power. And when we recognize and honor that power that is innate in our deep experience of our humanity in our spirit, then it helps us shake loose some of the constraints that we might believe that we have.
That's a powerful answer, and to a very, very difficult question. Hey guys, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. We are talking to a woman who we could talk to for hours and hours, and I can't even believe the hour is almost up. It goes by way too fast. She is Reverend Jennifer Bailey. She has written a book, To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And she is giving copies to us, to the WBAI family. We're so fortunate to receive these gifts from her. And if you would like a copy of her book, a book of love letters with so much history and heart, and in the covenant of her understanding of the Bible today, I mean, there's so much rich history and understanding in this book. If you'd like to have a copy, please make a donation of $30 to WBAI. You can make it in the name of Dreamleapers and tell them that you want a copy of To My Beloveds, and you can receive it. You can call us at 212-209-2950, or you can go online at give2wbai.org. And we only have a few minutes left in this broadcast, so wait until the broadcast is over and then call 212-209-2950 or go to give2wbai.org. Again, for a modest donation of $30, you can have a copy of Jennifer Bailey's book, To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. You say so many interesting things in your book. I want to share a couple of them. You say that memory can be used as an antidote to death. You say that imagination can be a pathway to resurrection. That that you can live as a testament of the possibility of the present. These are such uplifting thoughts. And I love this idea. And I think the first, memory as an antidote to death, I think a lot of people have a sense of that when they gather around, even like at a funeral, you gather around and you invite people to talk. And then you get to hear, I don't care what that person was like, there's something redeeming about that person that's going to be said.
Exactly. They could be a scoundrel and you'll find the one good thing, right?
You find that one good thing. And so you have those tears of joy and release because of the memories. And then over time, we know in traditional Black culture anyhow, people tell you the elders come back. You call on them, they come back. Sometimes you don't even have to call on them, and you hear, like, I hear my father's voice in my ear all the time, and he's been gone more than 20 years. So what does that mean, this idea of memory as an antidote to death?
And that comes really out of my experience, both with my mom's death, and today is actually the anniversary of the death of one of my close friends from high school who died a year ago. And what I know to be true is that when I think about my mom and sitting at the table with my mom, preparing dinner, when I think about my friend Glendon, who passed away last year, and just the foolishness we got into in high school, like things I don't want to speak aloud because my daddy still don't know, right? It brings a smile right. It brings a smile to my face, right? And he's no longer dead in the sense that he is gone and away, but it brings my mom, it brings Glendon close to me. And so that's what I mean as by memory as an antidote to death. And we know both in the Black tradition and my husband is Jewish. So in the Jewish tradition, right, there are these ways in which we remember. And when we remember, we bring people back to life, right? We bring people back to our consciousness, to our present, right? We bring the past into the present so that it can help inform our future. And so in my deepest moments of grief and lament, it has been memories and my memories that have brought me back into this place. And as I'm talking to you today, I even think about my experience as a minister going to visit people who are sick and shut in, who have Alzheimer's and who have memory loss, right? It might be a song that prompts them into joy, right? But there's something about that brings them back. And so, I hold really tightly to that notion when loss happens around me, that I can bring people back, that I can conjure, that I could be magic myself, right? And conjure their presence into a space.
We just have a couple of more minutes. There's so many things you write about in the book, but one that I'd like you to address briefly, which is suicide. You talk about it. And I've talked to many people during this COVID period, this period of isolation, who have had very serious thoughts of suicide. And as we know, sometimes people do take their lives. You address it head on, and writing a letter to a young man who was an activist who committed suicide on the steps of his, I think, state office building. But the point of, for anybody who is listening, as a minister, what can you share to help them not make that choice, to save their souls?
So let's first begin with the disclosure that I myself have struggled with suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety for much of my life. And so first thing I would say is that they're not alone, right? And the feelings of despair that they might have, and that, the challenges that they might be facing. There's this really old refrain that says that suicide is sort of a temporary solution to, or a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I've always found that to be problematic because, particularly for Black and Brown folks, like the problems we face aren't temporary, right? They're systemic. And so just as our traumas are politicized and institutional, so too must our healing be. And so if I was actually talking to one of my colleagues in ministry, suicidal ideation, depression is not something we pray away. We can pray, right? Like, I think prayer is an important resource for us, but we also, it's okay to call people who are mental health who are professionals, right? It's okay for us to honor the particular challenges that our people are facing in our mental health and see ourselves as part of a wraparound support system for people. And if there is somebody who might be listening in today who is considering taking their own life, know that you're not alone, that there are resources available to you. There's a National Suicide Hotline and other resources that are available. And I think, know that your life is precious, that you are beloved even by people you may not know you are beloved by too, and that you're not alone. And I found that in the depths of my depression and deepest moments of depression, it was remembering that I wasn't alone that helped pull me back out of that space of despair. And so therapy is an amazing thing, right? For those who have access to it. And the church can be one space, if you are a religious person, to seek comfort, to seek solace. And to my colleagues in ministry, it's okay to not have all the answers and seek professionals to help, because the worst thing we can do is preach a theology that is not helpful and drives people further away.
If there's one word or thought that you'd like to share with my audience before you go, as they move into this last quarter of the year, what would that be?
I would encourage them to find some spaces of joy, right? I think so often everything feels heavy right now. And I have the blessing of having a 1-year-old at home who is sometimes a source of great stress, but mostly a source of great joy as he's discovering everything for the first time, much to my consternation sometimes. And so, whatever it is that allows you to have a small space of joy, if it's hitting up your homegirl and having a kiki, if it's taking delight in a bite of chocolate, whatever it is those small joys that helps renew our spirit. And so, yeah, find some joy in your life, whatever makes you happy. And who cares who judges it? It's yours. so,
All right.
so do it.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Jennifer Bailey, author of To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. Really a fine book that is soul stirring in all the right ways. Thank you so much for being with us
Thank you
today.
so much for having me.
Wonderful. Hey, you guys, what a great episode of Dream Leapers. I love talking to Reverend Dr. Jen. And do get a copy of her book. And meanwhile, I want you to remember that on Saturday, October 16th, we are having our first ever virtual Dream Leapers retreat titled What's Next? That's what we're going to be talking about. It's chock full of speakers, experts who are going to examine everything from getting your head right to financing your dream and everything in between. We'll have examples of people who have made the pivot from a really dark place to a place of pure joy and profit. So please go to my website. You can go to dreamleapers.com and sign up for this free event. It's being sponsored by Toyota and Google, and therefore it's free to you. And until we meet again, have a great day and make it count.